On the plaza of glass and rain, the city breathed in slow, luminous pulses. Street lamps hung like suspended stars along the arc of the square, their halos quivering with a spectrum that wasn't light so much as possibility. The air carried a hush, a rumor of futures brushing past twinned almost in thin air, as if two timelines shared a single breath and held their own against the next. In that hush, a pattern of entanglement rippled above the crowd like a dancer's cue, a lattice of glittering lines that connected strangers, moments, and remembered histories in a geometry that refused to stay still. The entanglement display wasn't a trick of technology or an art show. It was the city's confession and its threat, the visible skeleton of every choice made here, and every memory carried away to drift in another possible world. Human thought, reorganized as threads of correlation, flickered from the ground to the sky and back again, looping through the faces of passers-by, as if the future were a choir singing through us. The square wasn't merely a place to gather, it was a portal to auditable futures, a space where time itself could be checked like a ledger. Nara Vex stood at the edge of the crowd, her gaze skimming the winking threads with an ease born of years spent watching timelines breathe. Her body carried the weight of a refugee's silence, the way a faraway storm leaves the air sour with memory even after it has passed. Nara wasn't the kind of person who used the word hero for herself, though others might have called her that if they'd seen the way she moved through the world. Careful, precise, always listening for the tiny tremor in a neural map that betrayed divergence. Nara was its clockmaker. Lin's presence was a quiet redefinition of what a shadow could be. A shadow that glowed with the faint light of 1,000,000 microcubits tucked into a glass eye. A shadow that spoke in equations and soft metaphors. Lin wore a coat patterned with shifting runes that mapped the city's temporal margins, the places where a street's memory might ripple into a future. Lin wasn't flashy. Lin was exact. People who knew Lin had learned to hear the way he spoke to time in the same way you learn to listen to an instrument when the orchestra warms up. Softly, with a patient grammar of intervals and caution. They moved with the crowd as though they traveled above the ground, rather than through it. Nara's steps were measured, the way someone walks when they know the ground might suddenly dissolve beneath you and you need to land somewhere safe. The detours of the square's entanglement offered a chorus of futures. Some paths bright with the laughter of children who would never grow old. Others shadowed by the tremor of losses a life would carry to the grave before the first birthday. "Can you feel it, Nara?" Lin asked, not turning his head, but letting the question roll from his lips like a careful breath. The line between choice and consequence, it thins here. Nara smiled faintly, a gesture more by reflex than joy. Always thinner than we want to admit. It's why we audit, Lin. It's why we stay close to the edge of what we can bear and pretend it's only data. The square wasn't a neutral space. No city square ever is. It was a living ledger, a stage they pretended to share with ordinary people, while watching the more dangerous accounts be balanced in the off-stage rooms of the city's memory net. They were here to meet the auditor who kept the timelines honest, a role that sounded grand even when performed with the same quiet restraint Lin wore like a favorite coat. The person in question stood near the center of the plaza, a figure in a coat that shimmered with a substance like rain that has learned to hide in the folds of cloud. They introduced themselves with a cautious tilt of the head and a voice that suggested both patience and gravity. "Welcome to the audit," said the woman. She had a name that sounded like a weather pattern, Astra Kestrel. But everyone knew she was the sort who wore many names, depending on who you were and what you believed. Her eyes reflected the entanglement above them in a way that made even the most confident a person feel a moment of disorientation, as if the future were an interior mirror and not a place you could walk into without noticing. Astra's job, in the simplest terms, was to measure the integrity of neurosynchrony, the alignment between a person's sense of self and the paths their minds might take if a different decision had been chosen. The city had grown used to calling this process an audit because it reserved the word for something solemn and orderly. rather than the messy, painful work of watching lives bend under the pressure of history. The truth was less ceremonial and far more intimate. To audit a timeline was to watch someone's sense of self stretch and snap like a bowstring under heavier tension than it was built to endure. Nara stepped closer, the weight of the square slowing her breath, as if the very air needed time to consider what was about to happen. Lin drifted to her side, the glow from his eye patch dappling across his cheek in a way that made him look almost like a creature born of starlight and careful calculation. Astra's voice softened. "We are at a crossing of fates today, and not the kind you can navigate with a map. The entanglement is thick here. It hums with the wrong kind of attention." Two futures brush against each other and try to claim the same present, and the city doesn't know how to hold them apart without tearing something important. "Is this where we find the breach?" Lin asked, his tone flat but not cold. He had learned to speak in questions when fear lurked too close to the edge of certainty. "Always where two possibilities share a breath," Astra replied. "We audit to learn which breath to stop. Sometimes the solution is to sever the neural link that makes a future feel possible enough to reach back and pull the present forward." Nara's hand found Lin's sleeve, a small pressure that needed no words. They both looked up at the fountain of luminal threads, their light now streaming into a central node that pulsed with intensity. The square had become a stage, the city a choir, every spectator a potential witness to the moment when memory and possibility would either remain coherent or fracture under the pressure of a choice. The audit began with data, not with confessions or fears. Astra activated a holofan, a device that hovered between their hands and hummed with the memory of countless lives. On its surface, a living map unfolded, threads of neural pathways, each a different version of a life's decision, each vibrating at a distinct frequency. Astra explained as the map warmed, "Neural timelines aren't memories alone. They are possibilities colored by emotion, by fear, by hope. When we alter them, we don't just shift a memory. We bend the moral architecture that holds a person together. We risk identity fractures. The sense of being whole might splinter into a constellation of selves, each with a different opinion about what you once were, each with a different name for who you are." Nara's breath caught in her throat. The idea of being several people at once, each with a different memory of who she had been, moved through her like a windstorm. The thought of erasing a community's shared memory to save another future was even more unsettling. Astra showed them a graph, a tree of possible futures. In the leftmost branch, a city that remembered its elders and kept their voices alive in council chambers, even as reality drifted in a harsh wind toward a new era. In the rightmost branch, a city that would forget old loyalties in favor of a lean, efficient future where memory was a luxury few could afford and many would surrender. The middle path was jagged and uncertain, a map of compromise that promised neither safety nor dignity in equal measure. "The goal isn't to pick a single path," Astra said, guiding the holofan's glimmer with a slow, careful touch. "The goal is to measure the cost of choosing any path and to decide what you're willing to give up for the futures you hope to save." Nara looked toward Lin, and for a moment she saw the city reflected in his gaze. The entire spectrum of the present and the possible folded into a single fragile moment. Lin's lips pressed into a line, then loosened in a breath that seemed to willow into time itself. "We're here for the audit," Lin said. "If two futures collide so violently that one must die for the other to live, we owe it to both to understand what is truly being sacrificed." Astra nodded. "Then we begin with the most dangerous one, the possibility that a city's identity can be drained by a quick fix. A shadow regulator has proposed something called a drain, a system update that would siphon away memories, friction, and identity from those who are inconvenient to the regime that wants to keep time perfectly aligned, and in doing so, power itself becomes scarce, no longer by virtue, but by theft." The words landed with a quiet thunder. Nara's mind shivered at the possibility, a quick fix that eliminated who a person was, in order to keep the future stable. It sounded like a cure that was worse than the disease it intended to treat, a language that betrayed the idea that history and memory were not commodities, but moral commitments. The audit's days stretched into a sequence of careful tests. They studied the entanglement's behavior at different hours when people returned to themselves in the corridors of memory. They observed how the city's neural networks could compensate for small divergences, but not for large ones. The moment when a person's identity would refuse to cohabit with the alternative path. It was in the small anomalies, Astra explained, where the truth would reveal itself, the subtle corrosion that could lead to a wider rupture if left unchecked. Astra brought them to a room that was half laboratory, half home, the place where she kept the community sing, a ritual memory that allowed citizens to recite shared histories in a chorus that the city could hear. A kind of living museum that didn't require a museum to exist outside time. The room was circular with a bench of polished stone around a central table that bore the mark of 1,000 hands lifting together, as if to remind the room that every memory was a shared burden and a shared privilege. Here, Astra said, tracing a finger along the edge of the table, we remind ourselves what a community owes to itself. Not to preserve every single moment in amber, but to keep alive the memory of what it took to build something together. If we lose that, then futures aren't saved. They're replaced with sterile promises. The first crisis came quickly and almost invisibly, a glitch in the entanglement, a tremor in the air, a moment where a citizen's eyes dimmed for a breath and then brightened, as if a memory had brushed against their brain and left a smear across their sense of who they were. It was minor, but in the audit's context, it was a scream, a warning that something was wrong with the balance between the present and the possible. The next day, they found the cause, a signal in the city's quantum mesh, a rogue thread braided into the fabric of time by a faction that worked in the gaps. The Shadow Regulator, a faction of time bureaucrats who believed that time belonged to those who could enforce its order. Their leader, known publicly only as Umbra, had seeded a potential fix that promised to stabilize the timeline by draining away memory and identity from those who refused to yield to the regime's design for the city's future. It wasn't ideology that drove Umbra. It was a calculus of power. If time could be made clean, if memory could be pruned to a manageable threshold, then control could be absolute. Nera and Lin, together with Astra, followed the rogue thread through the city's memory net and into its darker underbelly, where time's losses are traded like coins, and the weak are schemed into cornered corners. They discovered a hidden facility, an annex to the regulator's core infrastructure, where the drain coded as a fast fix by those who marketed it as a cure lay waiting. It wasn't a physical device in the traditional sense. It was a protocol, encoded in a city's neuromapping software, humming with a dangerous elegance that could siphon off the cognitive residua the city calls identities, and reallocate them toward a singular, unidirectional timeline. The team's discovery sparked a confrontation that wasn't a confrontation in the ordinary sense. It was an entanglement of ethics, memory, and fear. Umbra's followers wore the mask of order and stability, arguing that the city could not sustain itself if every person kept a different version of the truth inside their head. They argued for a clean timeline, a future that did not suffer from the messy past in the way that life everywhere tends to. Nara listened to Umbra's argument in a quiet part of the facility. The sort of conversation you have with a shadow, rather than with a person who can be persuaded by reason. Umbra's voice had the resonance of someone who has spent a lifetime sharpening the edge of a blade, someone who believed that power required sweeping away every obstacle in the form of messy memory. The past is not a ledger that can be audited for perfection, Umbra said. It's a living rumor that gnaws at us until we rewrite it. If we can rewrite the worst, then we can guarantee the best. Nera didn't argue. She spoke only after a long breath, letting the air in her lungs taste of rain and copper and memory. The worst isn't the memory. It's what we do to people when we think we must fix something that is already broader than any single mind can bear. Umbra's mouth curved in a smile that wasn't kind, but was somehow patient. Your ethics don't scale, the Shadow Regent murmured. They're a luxury of the lucky. And you're asking us to abandon a future that will bring more people back to themselves, even if we must lose some that currently strangle others with their own histories. The words should have felt cold. They didn't. They felt like a blade that glints in the right light. Dangerous, but necessary. A thing you could use if you believed it would save something you cared about more than yourself. Astra watched from the edge of the room, the lines of her face soft with worry and resolve. The city doesn't bend to the will of those who claim to speak for time, she said, her voice carrying the measured calm of a parent who has seen too many storms to be fazed by a single thunderclap. It bends to those who are willing to take responsibility for every remembered life. We must choose whether we will share memory as a public good or privatize time for power. The decision wasn't to cut or to preserve in a single moment. It was to sever the neural link, if only for a time, between two futures that had forcibly collided in the square and threatened to drag the city into a paradox. The plan was to create a controlled severance, a surgical pause in the entanglement that would force a new alignment, a way to keep the timelines intact without letting illness of memory fracture the social fabric. The process had 3 stages. First, the team would isolate the clone of the entanglement that linked Nera's own timeline to a future that might erase a city's old loyalties. Second, they would apply a surgical recalibration to the neural maps, reducing the risk of identity fractures by guiding memory along a more coherent path. Third, they would release the city's memory ecosystem from the drain's hold for a moment to test whether the city could survive as a multi-threaded organism rather than a monolithic machine. The morning of the severance, the plaza became a theater again, but this time with a different audience, the citizens themselves, who stood in lines of semaphore, watchers, and programmers, all waiting to see whether the city's living memory would survive a test that could end with a paradox or with a new ethic. The air near the central node carried a scent of rain on metal, an olfactory reminder that even memory has weather. Nara stood beneath the entanglement as Lin prepared the calibration, his hands steady in a way that suggested he had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head and 1,000,000 more in dreams. Astra's voice was quiet in her ear, the language of a surgeon who doesn't want to alarm the patient. "We begin," she said. The first moment of the severance felt like a breath you take when you're about to dive into cold water, inside your chest, a sharp, bright ache that becomes a dull numbness as air leaves the lungs. The neural links across the city's memory mesh trembled. The air shivered, and the entanglement threads paused, their glow stuttering like a candle that has been frightened into flicker. For a heartbeat that stretched into 2, the street below seemed to tilt up toward the heavens. Then, with a gentle sigh of digital wind, time resumed. What happened next was not the dramatic collapse of reality, but the quieter, more profound change of a city learning to live with its memory differently. The 2 futures that had collided began to drift apart again, no longer locked in a fatal embrace, but moving as 2 ships separated by the same tidal current. It wasn't a victory, not in the sense of conquering an enemy or retrieving a lost treasure. It was an act of restraint, a moral choice to allow the memory of a life to belong to its own continuum, rather than to a future that demanded its erasure or its subjugation. In the aftermath, the city found itself changed, not in the grand, flashy way of a fireworks show, but in the slow, enduring way that a new ethic sometimes appears, as a change in how people talk about memory, how they tell their stories to each other, and how they decide who gets to decide which future is worth saving. Nera realized that the audit's real test was not whether the severance was technically successful, or whether the future could survive without a particular memory. It was whether the people who stood to gain or lose would choose to shoulder the responsibility that came with the act of keeping time honest. The city's citizens began to talk openly about memory in terms of consent and accountability. Who held a memory, who could choose to keep a memory, and who had the right to erase or modify it for the sake of a broader good. Some days later, as the plaza's entanglement display dimmed into a soft, almost sleeping glow, Astra called Nara and Lin to a quiet corner near the fountain. The air hummed with a gentle afterglow, the residue of what had happened, the lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted in the city's shared consciousness. "You've done something that will outlast us," Astra said, not with triumph, but with the gravity of someone who recognizes the arduous task of shaping a future that respects memory as a social contract. The city will never be the same because it learned to bear the responsibility of every remembered life. Nara looked at the people around them, the faces lit with the soft, forgiving light of the entanglement's sunset glow, the children who would grow up with grandparents who still remembered their youth, the elders who spoke with the confidence born of having watched the long arc of time bend and recover. She thought of the long line of refugees who would come after her, their own timelines shedding and regaining shape as they navigated a world where memory was both a gift and a burden. Lin placed a hand on her shoulder. His eye patch reflected the last of the holographic threads in the air, a mosaic of potential futures now simply part of the city's memory. "We're not done," he said. "There will be more audits, more tests, more moments when we have to choose whether to interfere with the delicate thread of time, or to let it heal at its own pace. But this moment of restraint feels right. It feels like a beginning, not an end." Astra's face softened. "Time is a patient teacher," she replied. "It will test you again, with a gentler challenge next time. And when it does, you'll know what to do because you've learned how to ask a different question. Not how to fix everything, but how to ensure that whatever is remembered remains something worth remembering." The city began to adapt in small but meaningful ways. The memory economy that had once threatened to turn life into a ledger of debts found a new balance. People began sharing memories with each other in more deliberate communal ways. Memory libraries appeared in neighborhoods, not as sterile repositories, but as living spaces where people could listen to the voices of those who had lived earlier and decide how their own lives would fit into the ever-growing chorus of remembered life. The concept of identity maintenance evolved from a private concern to a social practice. When someone discovered a fracture in their own timeline, the city offered support, counseling, and a public platform to address the ethical consequences of choices made to save futures at the cost of others. A new ethic dawned, not as a decree from on high but as a collective experiment. Every person, every identity, was now seen as part of a shared moral fabric. The memory of elders, the recollections of workers who had built the city's first bridges, the dreams of students who would someday leave their mark on the world. These memories belonged to a city that understood responsibility as a living duty rather than a solemn obligation. The narrative of the city changed in its retellings. The square's entanglement, once a spectacle, became a constant reminder that time is not simply a resource to be allocated or a force to be harnessed. It is a relationship that binds people to one another across infinity, and with that binding comes risk, but also a possibility, the chance to build futures together, without erasing the past that made them possible. And in the quiet hours, when the plaza's lights dimmed to a restful blue, and the city settled into the hush after a day of revelation, Nara would walk the perimeter of the square alone for a time, listening to the city's memory rearranging itself into something new. She would pause at the central node where the final audit had happened, and listen to the faint thread of two futures that still glowed within the air, not as a restless entanglement, but as a soft, shared memory that now belonged to everyone, people who remembered themselves and people who remembered others. And people who remembered both. There remained the knowledge that the rival faction, the Shadow Regulator, and its leader, Umbra, still existed somewhere in the city's margins, quietly refining their own means of manipulating time's currents. They were not eradicated by the audit. They were confined, a dangerous undercurrent that could rise again if the city forgot the lesson it had just learned. The moral of the story wasn't that they had been defeated, but that the city had found a way to live with them, to acknowledge the threat as a possibility to be prepared for, rather than a destiny to be surrendered to. The city's new ethic demanded vigilance in memory's stewardship, and a constant willingness to bear responsibility for every remembered life, no matter how small, how old, or how distant that life might feel. Nara and Lin remained partners in this ongoing project of collective memory. Their work no longer a mission born of necessity alone, but an oath to the future they would help shape. They understood that the future would always exist in debate, in the friction of competing possibilities, in the choices people made when confronted with a time that threatened to swallow them whole. And yet they also knew that the human impulse could be stronger than the fear of losing one's own identity. The impulse to tell a story so that others might understand, to care for a life not their own, to choose not merely for themselves, but for the memory of every person who had ever lived in the city. The square continued to glow with the soft, patient light of entanglement, a reminder that futures could collide, but did not have to shatter the present beyond repair. It stood as a beacon for a new era of responsibility, a beacon that called every curious mind to consider not just the wonders of what could be done with time, but the responsibility of what must be done to ensure that those possibilities did not come at the expense of people's lives. And so the city learned to live with two futures in its air, not as a threat, but as a shared invitation, a call to imagine the possible, to tend to memory with care, and to remember that the most radical act of science beyond invention, beyond power, beyond prestige, might be to take responsibility for every life that memory touches. As the sun slipped behind the towers and the day's color bled into velvet night, a subtle greenish glow began to creep along the edges of the square's memory threads. It was the city's nervous smile, a sign that the audit had not ended, but had become a habit, a discipline by which a community could live with the heavier truth that memory is not a private possession, but a boundless public good. Nara looked up once more at the entanglement, now a softer echo of its former brilliance, and listened to the city's breath. It was not a perfect breath, and it would not become one as time moved forward. But it was enough to know that the future could be held without destroying the past that allowed it to exist in the first place. In that quiet knowledge lay the beginning of a story that would extend far beyond that day, into a world where people chose memory, not as a weapon or a commodity, but as a covenant, the obligation to protect every remembered life, and to accept the weight of that duty with courage, humility, and steadfast hope. The square's last light flickered, and the city exhaled as one. The future, once a collision in thin air, was turning into a shared horizon. And while the echo of a shadow regulator's scheme lingered in the wings, the room of time, once a battlefield and a ledger, now stood as a classroom where citizens learned to bear the responsibility for every remembered life. Curious minds, subscribe, like, comment, and share for more mind-bending futures.